Good evening from Washington, D.C. I'm Charlotte Ickes, Curator of Time-Based Media and Special Projects at the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery.
And I'm Saisha Grayson, Curator of Time-Based Media at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, also in DC. We're both excited for this program and that you could join us here in cyberspace. Although we're tuning in from different places, we wanted to take a moment to gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we each sit, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in DC, New York, and across the continent. For myself, I'm in Queens, New York, or Lenape-Hoking, the traditional lands of the Lenape peoples past and present. And we are so pleased to welcome you from wherever you are to tonight's event with Joan Jonas. This program is part of Viewfinder, Women's Film and Video from the Smithsonian, a year-long virtual screening and conversation series featuring an array of moving image works by women across Smithsonian collections. And this is generously supported by the Smithsonian American Women's History Initiative because of her story. And I just want to say it's been so energizing to working on this with Charlotte and our colleague Maureen Iskro at the Rehearsal Museum. We've been organizing this series and having it roll out with Joan is so great. And in this first sequence of programs, we decided to focus on the idea of interiority, understood physically, psychologically, or otherwise, a theme that felt particularly resonant during this global pandemic. Each virtual program of the series will occur on the first Thursday of every month. Next month's program is Zina Sarawiwa on Mourning and Memory at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Thursday, March 4th. For more information on that and upcoming events in the series, please visit womenshistory.si.edu/events/viewfinder. For this program, we will have live closed captions available, and that can be accessed along the bottom of your Zoom menu, as can the question and answer function. And we really encourage you to submit questions. We'll get to as many of them as we can during the second half of the event. And as someone with a deep iPhone addiction, I want to make a gentle suggestion for the length of these videos that we put aside other screens and really give ourselves over to these works from a time when intimate relationships with screens was a new concept. So both videos have this rhythmic, hypnotic quality that is just best experienced by staying with them. So that's my invitation to you. Charlotte?
Thanks, Saisha. I'm thrilled you've joined us tonight for these special screenings of Joan Jonas's iconic videos, Left Side, Right Side, and Vertical Roll, both from 1972 and part of the National Portrait Galleries and the Smithsonian American Art Museum's respective collections. And I want to especially thank Joan for generously allowing us to screen these works here tonight. It's a difficult task to put into words how Jonas has transformed and expanded our capacity to imagine what an artwork and artist practice can be. Over her career, Jonas has had hundreds of exhibitions and performances around the world, including her recent retrospective at the Tate Modern in 2018. And in 2015, she represented the United States at the Venice Biennale. Technology and becoming, magic and revelation, formalism and the feminine, return and repetition, not to mention recurring appearances of masks, monitors, and mirrors, all beautifully entangle in Jonas's groundbreaking videos, performances, and installations. In a moment when interior life, as Saisha said, is acutely felt, I'm curious to think about what Jonas said of her early experiments with video. Quote, "When I started working with video, I thought of crawling into the monitor. I imagined the monitor was a box that I could crawl into." What does it mean to inhabit a medium one knows so well, a medium as material, as physical and psychic space? What and where are the limits and openings once you've crawled inside? It's been a privilege and pleasure to think deeply about these works, and I'm looking forward to discussing these questions and more with the artists and my dear colleague Saisha over the next approximately 75-ish to 90 minutes or so. So for the evening's order of operations, we'll first watch Left Side, Right Side, which is about 9 minutes long, followed by a brief conversation with myself, Joan, and Saisha. Then we'll screen Vertical Roll, about 20 minutes in duration, before moving on to further discussion and questions from you, our audience. So thank you so much, and please enjoy the rest of the evening. Hi.
Hi.
Welcome to the screen. You there, Saisha?
I am.
Okay. Are we all here? Okay, great. So after watching this work again, and I was talking to friends, it really takes on a new, prior to this, a new resonance in the Zoom era. But I'm thinking about this lovely quote of yours where you say, in order to do a performance, even for the camera, I have to create a very specific place, kind of a little theater set within the landscape framed by the camera. So I'd love to hear, and I know our audience would, what kind of little theater did you make for left side, right side? And, you know, what arrangement of objects and why did you arrange them in that way?
Well, left side, right side is a slightly different example. Not really a little theater, but it's a setup of the technology of the mirror and the monitor and a blackboard in which I sat and situated myself and worked in relation to that situation, which was the idea of comparing on one level the monitor and the mirror and putting, you know, pointing out the way one reverses left and right and the other one doesn't. And so that interested me at the time. And this idea of pointing and that I was doing, I did that in a performance. Actually, I first did that action in a performance because from the very first use of the video, and when I got the video, I thought of it in terms in relation to film and as a new technology, what are the peculiar aspects of this? So in the case of left side, right side, I'm simply, well, a performer in the situation, working within that space. And I didn't really place the props or only the mirror. They were within a distance that I could easily pick them up. Very practical placement.
Right. And this was not at your, if I recall, this was not at your studio. This was off-site somewhere.
Well, it wasn't in my studio because at that time, technically, I could not have done it in my, you know, I didn't have two cameras and a switcher. So we did it live at the studio.
I don't know about you, Saisha, but at least for me, the act of drawing, and I think the familiar sounds associated with it, so that kind of almost grating sound of chalk on chalkboard is pretty grounding in this otherwise, you know, hard to piece together, disorienting video. And drawing, of course, is kind of like the elemental gesture of art, that of the line. And so I'm curious why you brought the technology of video together with drawing in this work. What was their relationship?
Well, from the very beginning, when I switched from sculpture to performance, and then later, a year or two later to video became part of that. I brought drawing into it and I drew in my performances from the very beginning and in my videos. And so I drew in relation to the medium of video in this case. Well, it's not really in this case, but I drew in relation to the monitor. So I made drawings for the monitor, for instance, that you could see on the monitor, and I could make a little drawing in a performance and it would be blown up on the monitor. Or one idea was to look at the monitor and not look at my paper and to draw for the monitor. In this case, you know, I also use blackboards and chalk. So in this case, with the blackboard behind me, I'm sitting with the blackboard behind me. I also made these drawings in my performances and then in videos based on drawings I found in a book of collected essays about rituals and ceremonies and a tribe in New Guinea from the Malukian Book of the Dead. And these drawings, there are different examples of that, different loop structures on a grid that I learned how to make and made them in performances. I had no one to ask permission, and I thank whoever originated those drawings, as you were previously thanking the people whose land that we're all on. Anyway, so I use these endless drawings, is what I call them. I don't know if that's what they call them, in my work because they're performative. And they were made, I like very much bringing the idea of myth and ritual into my work. They were made by what they call the devouring witch at the corner, where life and death come together, so that if you died, you had to know how to finish the drawing. The devouring witch on the other side of the line would start it and you would have to finish the drawing. And that's the history of that you don't know, but it is a ritualistic drawing.
That's so interesting, because one thing I was struck by was that the sound of the drawing and the act of the drawing coincide with the beginning of the humming, and which really also brings in this kind of sense of embodiment and returns it, to the performative beyond just the relationship with the video, which you're teasing out so much in the first part. And then you start talking about sun and moon. And so there's this sort of sense of placing the human in relationship to these different elements. And so it's really meaningful to hear you talk about it as ritual, because that was when that sensibility seemed to really come into it for me.
Yeah, I mean, I thought about the sun and the moon, the opposites, the form of the sun and the moon. I made many drawings in my performances of the sun and the moon, and I changed the sun into the moon by erasing a line and so on and so forth. But at that time, I was very involved with the underlying content of my work was based on myth, the history of mythology from different cultures, but it wasn't visible in that way. It's not a narrative. It is simply a spirit that I related to. And in relation to the landscape, I also had that relationship. And it was how I began to bring content into my work.
So as a curator at the Portrait Gallery, I would be remiss if I didn't ask this. Of course, this work was made in 1972. And I'm really interested to think about it in the context of the Portrait Gallery collection, and maybe some of the additional meanings that it takes on in that context. And I'm thinking about, you've said you never wanted to be Joan Jonas in the performance. And that's a really kind of amazing abdication of the ego, especially in a portrait gallery, which in many ways celebrates the self. And so I'd love to hear more about how you see this work now in this particular context, and the afterlives it might have.
Yes, you've asked me that before, and I thought about it since then. And so I'd say that just to have me sitting there wouldn't be, to me, so interesting. And so this is a portrait in a way. You could call it a portrait. I accept that term, although I wouldn't call it a portrait, but it could be. It's a portrait of a time. It's a portrait of my interests and my way of making things. It's a portrait of technology at the time. I mean, I think it's interesting when it begins, there are all these glitches and it kind of goes in and out. That was early video technology. And I think it's important that that is seen actually now. So I'm happy that it's in the Portrait Gallery. It's a different kind of portrait, which is actually to be expected.
Truly, and it's amazing. I mean, we'll see when we go into vertical roll soon. At some points you're wearing a mask, and you don't have a mask here, but you are drawing on your face, and you're staging really like this alienation from your own image in some ways, struggling to identify the basic parts of your own face in the face of this technology and the mirror. So I think it's such an incredible portrait, and shows the kind of constructed nature of all portraits, actually, even if they're, the most traditional type. So we're very lucky to have it. Saisha, you disappeared for a minute. I think
I did. I lost my internet.
Trouble in the internet, interweb world.
Glitches.
I'm so glad yes. Speaking of technological glitches.
Yeah, I think I lost you both right around the time, or maybe I came back as you were talking about technological glitches, and that might be a good opportunity to kind of shift thinking and talk about left side, right side, and vertical roll were made in the same year. And I was curious if you could talk about the evolution and the relationship between them, and maybe some other, works like your performances or As Organic Honey, and other ideas that were in the air that were sort of generating these, and particularly in the case of vertical roll, led to the genesis of that particular form.
Yeah, well, vertical roll and left side, right side both came out and were part of, in their development of a project that Organic Honey's started out as Organic Honey's visual telepathy, and it became Organic Honey's vertical role, which was my first video work, and partly was involved with the idea of what is the female in relation to the women's movement, which was a very important movement that had been going on for decades, but was at a certain point at that time. And I wanted to bring those questions into the work. What is the idea of the feminine or the female? What does that mean? And it's the same with, like, if you say, I'm not me, it's not me. I mean, who are we, you know? I mean, we construct ourselves. I think that's what video technology made very evident, that we construct our images, and of course actors do this in a different way, but the idea of being an artist and making video, you're not really an actor, and so when they look at you, they see, when the audience sees you, they see you. And I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in constructing something else, and in you could say hiding or constructing a persona. That was, I've called the persona in the Organic Honey, and so it's kind of like the opposite of me, and I did it with masks and costumes. And vertical role, we'll look at it in a minute, is a sequence of different movements that were part of the performance in a live situation, and also just part of vertical role. Because, as I said before, I was constantly questioning how video was peculiar. What are the peculiar aspects of video? Now, of course, that difference has disappeared on one, but then it was very evident. Filmmakers hated video. Filmmakers I knew, they hated video. It was so, you know, technologically terrible and indistinct, but all of us who are video artists loved, that's why we liked it. That's what drew us to it. And I always tell this story, maybe too many times. It's one of the things that inspired me when I first started working with the video, closed circuit video camera. I heard a story about Marilyn Monroe watching her make a film, and somebody who was watching her, seeing her sitting in front of the camera, they saw her profile and the camera, and then they saw what the camera saw. That interested me. That was very inspiring to me, that the camera sees something quite different from what we see looking at the subject in relation to the camera live, and so on.
Well, I can't wait to talk more about so many of the things you just said, but let's first watch the video together, and then we can really delve into it.
We'll see you guys in 20 minutes. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
No.
We're back. That work is such a tour de force. And, you know, really, as you said, gets so deeply inside the very idea of video and what it is that is unique about it, the simultaneity you were talking about, but also this particular glitch. And so I wanted to start by asking you sort of, at what moment did it crystallize that the vertical role, which is that, you know, technological glitch that we see throughout, the moving bar, for anybody who wasn't, you know, around at a period of time when you had to sync your TV to the video playback, and you might be frustrated in that moment, might not realize that was something that happened, you know, accidentally. It was a point of frustration, and you turned it into this incredible creative tool. So I just want to hear you talk more about that.
Well, it's part of the technology of early video. And at that time, all you had to do was to turn a dial to turn it on. I mean, you were always sometimes struggling with getting it off or making it stop or whatever, but it was never going regularly like that. It would sometimes start up. Anyway, by turning the dial, you could control the speed, more or less, not completely, but more or less. And so everybody knew about the vertical roll from the very beginning. It's not any kind of discovery. It was simply there and was part of the technology. The monitors, it's a knob on the monitor. So it's not in the video, it's not in the camera. You have to film. recorded this whole thing off a monitor. So there were two cameras. There was the camera recording my movements in the space, and the camera, and that image was passed to a monitor. And then the second camera filmed the whole thing off the monitor. And that's why in the end, I put my head in between to show that situation when I come in between the camera and the monitor.
It's such a startling moment.
Yeah, well, anyway, so it just took me, I didn't start right off to use the vertical roll as a technique, but then at one point, I thought I have to make something about the vertical roll. And then I started working on that. And
it seems, oh, sorry. Continue.
No, go on.
It seems so particularly productive for the conversation you were talking about earlier in terms of feminism and the idea of sort of a constructed image and how media constructs certain ideas of the feminine body. And here's this glitch that actually deconstructs literally and breaks up the image and, you know, does so much in alignment with some of the ideas you were thinking about. Was there a moment when you thought particularly about the deconstructive aspect of it and what that could do for this work, for the mixing of the performance and the monitored work?
I have to tell you, frankly, I didn't think of the word deconstructive until years after that. I mean, it wasn't part of my working vocabulary.
Yeah.
But what I did think of was perception and how we perceive. So a part of this is the perception and how that alters your perception. I was very interested in how I could alter the perception of the audience. And the vertical roll certainly does that, because you look at it and things keep changing. They don't really change, but the vertical roll has that trick of making you see things differently. So I filmed it. We made it in, actually it happened to be Robert Irwin's old studio. It was a beautiful white room in Venice, California. And we rehearsed that for 2 weeks. There are no edits in this piece, which was interesting to me at the time. Also, that was the thing about video, was it could be a continuous stream. And the vertical roll, those lines are in the technology, but I thought of them as frames in a film going by. And so we made it, we had to rehearse it, of course, to get it exact. Roberta Neiman was the camera person at the time. And she followed me around the room. I had to change clothes, costumes in between the shots. We put something in that she could put the camera on and so forth. So that was how it was made. And I thought of it this time, looking at it for the very first time after seeing it hundreds of times. I was noticing that because the sound I put on afterwards, the first sound you hear is the sound of the spoon hitting the mirror. And then after that, I'm hitting a block of wood together, two blocks of wood together, which I'd used in outdoor pieces. And I had to sit down in front of the TV monitor and do that as I was watching it, and do it in time to the vertical roll. So I was just watching it, and I didn't quite get that time, you know. Interesting the way it made it jump. It made it look like it was jumping sometimes. It depended on how you. And the other thing I did was to always have the monitor that I could look at in the space. So all my movements were made for the monitor, and I was looking at the monitor. I had another monitor in the space, a small monitor that the camera person and I could watch. All our moves, my moves, were for that vertical roll. Clapping the hand to watch the monitor, jumping in and out. I had to watch my framing all the time, and so on. So.
Yeah, that brings us back to something Charlotte said in the introduction, this idea of sort of being inside the monitor, inside of that box, and really making your movements, you know, in relationship to it, and really expressing a sense of interiority in that experience. Can you all hear the sirens?
Yeah,
I promised there would be sirens, of course.
And I fear you might hear my daughter screaming. So the sounds of life. We're getting a lot of, you're bringing something up, Joan, a lot of audience questions that are really great and we'll get to, but some of them circle around the question of improvisation versus rehearsal. And it's so interesting to hear you talk about kind of the precision of vertical roll. I'm curious how that tension were there moments of improvisation in vertical roll? And also going back to left side, right side, what is the relationship between rehearsal and improvisation?
Well, rehearsal for me was getting it together and making it and deciding exactly really pretty much how it was going to, it was about making images. And I wanted those images to be precise. And also the timing, it has to do with time. I mean, of course it could be improvised. It's another way of working. And some people and other people work differently. But I would prefer to be constructing the images, rehearsing them before so I can get them. And of course, there's always moments that you have to make little adjustments and things like that. That's improvisation. But generally, my method is not improvisation. I mean, I have in the past, as I loosened up over the years, yes, a little bit more. But in the beginning, particularly, I was interested in constructing.
Yeah. So in addition
but you
to
have
the,
to improvise to make, I'll say you have to improvise to get to that point. I mean, the first thing you do is you improvise, I did, in front of the camera. You improvise movements, you improvise working with props. You had to do that in order to make something. It didn't just spring out of your head, like that. It was slowly constructed.
yeah. I want to come back to this relationship with the camera and the monitor, because there's both the glitch in vertical roll, but also this very close relationship, as you were just describing, between what you're seeing instantaneously and then what you're doing and being able to modulate exactly to that experience. And you talked about the revelation of that, right? How different it is from film, which has to be processed and sent out. And then weeks later, you see what you look like. And that's no longer the experience of the screen. And so I was curious if you can talk about what that seemed to break open in terms of subjectivity or a sense of self that you were so interested in. And then maybe if you could share your thoughts, what do you think about the new relationship with screens where people are, from birth, basically able to understand themselves as an image that's mirrored back to them? You see babies scrolling on their Zoom.
I'm not, I always think I have no idea what it's like for them because it's in their heads, it's not in mine, but it's a completely natural everyday experience for them. For us to get that video closed circuit in our studios was a revelation, I have to just say. All the video artists that we can think of who started out that way with the camera and the monitor in their studio, making, from the very beginning, I was interested in film and I didn't formally study film, but I certainly studied it on my own by going to look at films and looking at as many as possible, going to the anthology film archives and so on. And so I was always wanting to make a film, and getting this video set up enabled me to what I call them make my own little films. So I immediately was able to make what I called little films at the time. And I went on from there.
That's so interesting. Another thing that struck me watching these two back to back again was that there were sort of call outs to film. The vertical roll, very much looks like a frame that's gotten stuck and is moving along. And so you're seeing the kind of breakdown of the magic of the still image going fast enough. And then in left side, right side, there's the turning on and off of the lamp, which is really sort of this light and shadow that's basically the essential pieces of filmmaking. And so I was curious why you really ended up dealing with film and video together. You didn't sort of break them apart, but you wanted to think them at the same time.
Well, each technology comes from the last technology. Film came out of theater in a way. Very early films, the directors are looking at theater. There was much more reference to early to theater, and even filming theater scenes, as part of the film. And so I related the video technology to the film because there is a relationship. We don't have to go into it now, but I saw that as a natural segue. And because I was so interested in film, and film was more or less my reference technology before I got the video camera, before video became, television was another thing. Television was a huge influence on theater and film, Ernie Kovacs, for instance, you know, his early, her shows were a big influence. The idea of somebody sitting and looking into the camera the whole time and doing everything like this for the television monitor. Of course, that came into it also. So it was a combination of these two things, but I never wanted my videos to actually look like film. I just thought of a way to segue myself to get an idea was to compare and think, what can I do with video that's not film? The vertical roll, you know, and then point out the left side, right side, and so on. There are things that you could do more easily. You could do these things in film. You could do a wipe, you could do it, all kinds of things. And also turning the light on and off. So one thing I keep saying is that I'm not interested in making special effects by technology. I'm interested in making special effects by hand. And of course, I don't always do that. And I sometimes do the other, but that was my interest, to show you what I'm doing, to show the process of the making.
Thank you. So I'm conscious that we have a lot of great questions, and we're coming up on dinner time. But I know Saisha and I are particularly interested. I think this will be our last question we ask you is, you know, how has quarantine, has it affected your practice in any way? Perhaps in your approach to space, that we've been really talking about, this kind of being inside a monitor, or perhaps it hasn't. But I do know that we're all feeling interior life quite a bit. And I'm always curious how that has changed the way artists make their work.
Well, for me, I've been making a lot of drawings and concentrating on that, and which I enjoy a lot, and it's an important part of my practice. And I'm working on a show in Singapore, in Beijing for the Biennale, which is all drawings, and there will be a video element in it. But I simply, I feel very cut off from that aspect. I don't go out. I don't go out with my camera. I don't work with my editor and so on. So yeah, how has COVID affected me? It's one thing I've enjoyed. I'll just say the positive things of being isolated.
Please.
Well, concentrating on drawing and then reading a lot, and also being in touch with people in a different way. I think that technology of this, what we're doing now, and the Zoom, you know, we knew how to do it before. We didn't have to, but now we have to. And I think that will be something that will continue in different ways, you know, because theater people, I know some people are making plays for the Zoom. I'm sure that will segue into something else. And so that's how it's affected them. But I haven't gotten into that, I have to say.
Well, thank you so much. I don't know, Saisha, if you want to pick one of the first questions. We've got a lot.
With a nice, easy one from the audience. What is the role of humor in your work? Which I think might give us a little levity after the COVID question.
Yeah.
Well, well, comedy is I love comedy. I mean, the form of comedy. And when I was got our first TV set when I was 11, we sat in front of the TV set and watched Sid Caesar and Imogen Coca from the very beginning. A lot of you don't know who that is. They were brilliant comedians. And my stepfather was an amateur comedian, very amateur. But so comedy was something as a form I was always interested in. For instance, a lot of comedians are nasty people, you know what I mean? So that interests me, the psychological aspect. And in my work, I don't think in my case, I can never try to be funny. But I know that some people think I'm funny, and it just comes spontaneously. But I think one friend of mine says she thinks my work is funny. I think it's because it's weird sometimes and kind of stiff and you know, straight faced. That's all I can say. I'll just say that it's something that interests me, but I don't do it consciously. And I hope that, I think it's very important. What was her name? Ruth. There was a woman, an older woman who's a comedian, and her name was Ruth. I can't remember her last name. I really think that when you get old, like I am, it's better to be funny than tragic.
Yeah.
No, but you could. If I was a great actress, I could do that. But
Yeah.
better to be funny.
So again, we're getting lots of this is amazing. Wonderful. Thank you for doing this. Here's a question. So I'm just going to read it. The camera here struck me as a sovereign entity, the architect of the work who employs pieces of your body as one of several hypnotic objects in its construction. Can you talk more about why you released your identity as Joan Jonas to the camera?
Why I released it? What does that mean? Why I got rid of it or what?
I guess so. Yeah, like why, it's maybe going back to the question about, you saying, I don't want to be Joan Jonas.
Oh, well, I mean, what does it mean for me to sit here and say, I am Joan Jonas? And I wanted to, and also it didn't enable me to play a part. I really need to play a different part. So whenever I do a performance or a video, I make a space and I step into it. It's like you step over the line from the everyday life into the performing life. And it really is it's another medium. It's just like I have to translate my work from video to performance. They're not the same. Video, the art of video, the art of performance, film, they're different mediums. And it's the same with the body, with the persona. Me every day is not me performing. And when I do performances, I don't think of me. I think of this, I think of actions that me wouldn't do, maybe. I don't know.
No, it does. It's great. I will say, I figured an audience member would know. Ruth Buzzy is the comedian. Is that the comedian that you were referring to? Our audience has offered
Ruth
that. Buzzy, B-U-Z-Z-Y. No? Okay, another Ruth.
She died a few years ago.
Okay. We'll go to Google. Yeah.
I think building off a lot of what you were just talking about, there's a nice question here that takes us, away from this flat screen experience that we're having and asks, can you talk about the installation of your videos and the viewing spaces you explored early on, how you made installation decisions in the early stage of your video work, and how that relates to themes of embodiment in the work? And I would open up, if you want to talk about how that has changed over time for you.
Well, when I first translated my, I have to say that my stage sets, I call them stage sets, were like installations. So it was part of the work. I didn't call them installations, but it was part of the work from the very beginning when I began to work with video and set up the camera and the monitor and the props and the objects. It was a stage set. And that's what I mean when I make a space that I can step into. When I first translated them for the show in Amsterdam in '94, for Organic Honey, just to take one piece, the kind of sounds I made for the videos were percussive. And so when I first made the first installation, I could play all the videos. I put everything that was part of the piece into the installation and arranged them. So Organic Honey, it was the same. It was similar to the stage set. I had a table with all my props arranged, the chair that was part of the performance, and then a big projection of the video of the performance and monitors with vertical roll. And I didn't put left side, right side in, but that was separate. But one called Duet, in which I howl with myself. So I just put all the elements together. Just to skip to now, I wouldn't do that now because, for instance, I work with Jason Moran. Lately, I've been working with Jason Moran, and you can't put anything else next to his music except for maybe abstract sounds, because it is what it is. And so with him, for instance, I work more on the video backdrops. I was thinking about that and how to explain that. Instead of thinking of stepping into the monitor, then it was very much of a physicality. The video equipment was physical objects, a monitor, a camera. We no longer have the monitors. So
right.
Now I step into the projections and I'm in the space of the performance. And so I construct the installations. Yeah, the projections are like backgrounds, and they're the second narrative. It's a double narrative. So before, when you were saying the narrative of me performing with the details projected because there was a live camera, now in the performance and the installations, you see these multiple narrations that are edited for the projections, so that I'll have 3 or 4 projections maybe, and arranged in a certain way. It's about arrangement. What is, installation, arrangement. And also it has to do with what kind of props you have, what do they mean and how do they fit? Is the prop in the picture, out of the picture? It's very hard to put it all in just a few words, but I don't know if that helps.
It does. I'm going to combine a couple questions here, and thinking about your collaboration, your more recent collaborations with Jason Moran. We've got some questions about, when vertical roll and left side, right side were made. Who was influencing your work? Who were you thinking about or in conversation with? And what was the reception of the work at the time?
At the time, in the 60s, I spent a lot of time going to happenings. I think the form of happening was one of the reasons I went into performance, because I saw that you could put things together. You could put sound and movement and so on. And also I was very interested in the dancers at the time, who happened to be mostly women, but Yvonne Rainer, Simone Forti, Deborah Hay, Trisha Brown, and Steve Paxton. I was inspired by them as dancers. And then the happenings, Klaus Oldenburg, his work. But I really wish not to look like any of them. And so I had to form my own language. But, and then I was in a milieu. It was exciting. Everybody really, I think the minimalists, I also had to get away from that. And Jack Smith was an artist who inspired me. If some of you don't know who he is, you should look it up. It's hard to know though, because these things are hard to see years later. But Jack Smith and Oldenburg, and anyway, many. I mean, when people say who influenced you, of course there are influences, but I looked at everything. I have to say, I really studied art history. I was very influenced by Renaissance paintings, by the space of Renaissance paintings, for instance. When I first started making performances and videos, I thought of framing a space like a painting, but not like a flat screen painting, a painting that had architectural space, although they didn't look like that at all.
That's interesting. I'm going to sneak in one of my questions along with an audience question, which was about your training in sculpture, because you just talked about space, but you also talked about Renaissance paintings. And there's the moment in vertical roll where you're sort of spinning around, the camera is spinning around you, and it feels sort of like a Bernini sculpture. So I was also curious if figurative sculpture was something that, helped you think through the treatment of the female body. But also any sort of ways in which your sculpture training came into play.
Well, my favorite sculptor for years was Giacometti. That really does not bring you to the female body. I love his work, and the idea that the figure was, this very, very thin, almost invisible figure was occupying a big space, that interested me. And I think the whole idea of walking into a room and walking around something was part of my training and also experience that inspired me. But I have to say I was more interested directly in painting. Giacometti, I would say.
That's great.
You kind of, I know we're coming to the end, but you touched on this briefly, but we have a question. Through your videoing of yourself in these early works and the adoption of organic honey, what did you discover about the question of the female, of femininity? What did the video medium and performance grant you in terms of understanding gender or gender difference?
I'll just say in general, for the video for women at the time, when it came out, was really so important because so many women could then put their energy into, you could say, screaming, about how they felt about, being a woman in our culture. For me, it was a chance to, because at the time there was all this discussion of male and female. I remember reading Moby Dick in college and talking about the masts on the ships being male, and it irritated me to have to do that, to assign a gender to objects. And so I wanted Organic Honey is really about, is this female? Am I making myself more female by wearing this mask? Yes, I thought it did make me look more female than I usually do look, but a mask and a headdress in a very traditional way, dressing up for the camera. And so when I started working with narration, with fairy tales and Icelandic sagas and so on, I always chose to work with female characters and to portray them and to really look and portray, not in a, it was always in the present, but using this ancient material. How are women depicted? I mean, very different in fairy tales. The wicked stepmother, the good mother, blah, blah. And then later on, they became more nuanced in the Icelandic sagas and so on. And so that's really partly what it was. How I think that I stopped calling myself a feminist. Of course I'm a feminist. And I was just recently reading about something about women and how, how they're treated. It's really unbelievable. But anyway, but other issues became really important to me too, other important issues. And I have to say, at the time of this COVID, I think certain political issues and have become more visible and more important, visible to us, I'll say that, which is very important.
That's so important and important to remember as we move through these different historical moments and come to the present and try to figure out what needs our attention. I wanted to look ahead. There was a nice question focusing on your relationship between your work and the interest in the medium of video. Is there a new recent technology that piques your interest now as video did then?
I have to say, it doesn't come to mind right now. But
fair
maybe.
Enough.
No, I mean, I have to confess that I've been doing Instagram just because I like the communication, making a little image it's another way of making an image, I have to say.
Yeah. And I think, for this generation, it is really interesting to think about what the perceptual shifts are that are coming from this kind of constant subject projection and subject shaping that we do through those kinds of social media avatars. And so I do think about your work as a real early instance of turning our attention to that process, even if the technologies have changed significantly in the.
I mean, some of my friends joke that my work is all about selfies.
We can know that now, but then it was.
No, we didn't know it then.
We did not know. Yeah. Well, I think we've taken enough of your time tonight. I will say there's some suggestions of Ruth Gordon as a.
That's it.
Okay, thank you, Sam and Lynn.
Yeah, thank
you. But I know Saisha and I have just been so excited for this. It's been a really bright spot and very
highlight of 2021.
Yeah, probably for the rest of 21. So thank you so much, Joan, for allowing everyone to see these just incredible works.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to the audience for an amazing amount of exceptional questions.
Truly.
Sorry we didn't get to them all.
Truly.
Thank you.
So thank you, Joan. We're so appreciative, and it was just a real pleasure. So
thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Everyone be well. And
enjoy dinner.
And there will be a recording that goes up once I have time to edit the transcript, which I will do as quickly as possible.
And that will be available for a month. So
So
Great.
please check out the Viewfinder website for the recording and also to sign up for our future events. Have a good
Thank
night,
you.
everyone.
Night.
night.
Bye-bye.